My husband was secretly keeping someone else's panties until his mom found them in his car. Before we begin, if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these real-life revelations. And if this story grips you, give it a thumbs up and share it. Your support means everything. Now, let's get into what happened that afternoon. My name is Rebecca, I'm 34 years old, and I've been married to Daniel for 9 years. For most of those years, I thought I had a normal marriage. Not perfect, because no marriage is perfect, but normal, stable. The kind of relationship where you know each other's routines and quirks and occasional secrets that don't really matter. Daniel worked as a regional sales manager, which meant he traveled sometimes. Overnight trips to meet clients, conferences in other cities, the usual business travel that comes with that kind of job. I worked as a dental hygienist at a practice 15 minutes from our house. Regular hours, predictable schedule. We owned a modest home in the suburbs, had been talking about starting a family, lived what anyone looking from the outside would call an ordinary middle-class life. But about 8 months ago, I started noticing small things. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have made me immediately suspicious. Just little changes in Daniel's behavior that individually meant nothing but together started forming a pattern I couldn't quite ignore. Daniel started taking more evening drives. He'd always been someone who liked to drive to clear his head, so when he started going out for an hour or two after dinner a few times a week, it didn't immediately register as strange. He said he needed to decompress after stressful days at work, that driving helped him think. I accepted that explanation because it wasn't inherently suspicious. People have different ways of managing stress, but the drives became more frequent and longer. He'd leave at 8 and not come back until 11. He'd leave his phone at home sometimes, saying he wanted to truly disconnect. He'd be vague about where he'd been, just driving around, no particular destination. And when he came home, he'd seem restless, not relaxed like someone who'd just spent hours clearing their head. More agitated, like the drives were making something worse instead of better. Then there was the glove compartment. Daniel had always kept his car meticulously clean and organized, but about 6 months ago, he started locking the glove compartment. I noticed because I borrowed his car one day when mine was in the shop, and when I went to get the registration from the glove box because I'd been pulled over for a broken taillight, I found it locked. A small lock that required a key, the kind you'd use on a diary or a desk drawer. When I asked Daniel about it later, he said he'd started keeping important documents in there and didn't want them getting lost or stolen if someone broke into his car. The explanation was plausible, but it was also the first time in 9 years of marriage that Daniel had felt the need to lock something away from me. I didn't push it, didn't demand to see what was in the glove compartment, because that felt like crossing a line into distrust, and I didn't want to be the kind of wife who needed to inspect her husband's car for evidence of wrongdoing. But the locked compartment sat in the back of my mind, joining the pattern of evening drives and vague explanations. Then came the changes in our intimate life. Daniel and I had always had a healthy relationship in that department. Not passionate like newlyweds, but comfortable and regular and satisfying for both of us. But starting around the same time as the evening drives, Daniel became less interested. He'd claim he was tired from work. He'd say he had an early meeting and needed sleep. He'd find reasons to avoid intimacy that became more frequent, until we were having relations maybe once a month. And even then, it felt like he was going through the motions. When I asked if something was wrong, if he was stressed or upset with me, Daniel assured me everything was fine. Just work pressure. Just getting older. Just the normal ebb and flow of long-term relationships. And I wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that these small changes were exactly what he said they were. Normal fluctuations in a long marriage. But doubt had started creeping in. The kind of doubt that makes you second-guess your own perceptions, makes you wonder if you're being paranoid, or if your instincts are trying to tell you something important. I did what a lot of women in my situation probably do. I started paying closer attention. Not actively snooping, but noticing, observing, trying to determine if my concerns were justified or if I was creating problems where none existed. I noticed Daniel was on his phone more. Not obviously, not in a way where he was constantly texting or ignoring me for his device, but I'd catch him looking at something and then quickly putting the phone away when I entered the room. I'd see notifications flash on his screen and watch him dismiss them immediately without reading them in front of me. Small behaviors that suggested he was communicating with someone he didn't want me to know about. I noticed his laundry habits changed. Daniel had always been particular about doing his own laundry, which I'd appreciated because it meant I had one less chore. But he became even more particular about it. He'd wash his work clothes immediately when he got home instead of putting them in the hamper. He'd insist on handling the laundry himself, even when I offered to help, like he needed to maintain control over what went through the wash and what I might see. I noticed his schedule became less predictable. The business trips that used to be planned weeks in advance would suddenly come up with only a day or two notice. Meetings would run late more frequently. He'd have dinner obligations with clients that I couldn't attend. His work life seemed to be consuming more and more of his time in ways that felt convenient for someone who wanted to be away from home more often. And through all of this, I kept asking myself the question that probably every woman in my position asks. Was my husband having an affair? The signs were there. The classic signs that marriage counselors and advice columnists list as red flags. Changed behavior, increased secrecy, less intimacy, more time away from home. But something about the pattern didn't quite fit the affair narrative. Daniel wasn't dressing better, or wearing new cologne, or doing any of the things men supposedly do when they're trying to impress someone new. He wasn't happier or more energetic in the way people having exciting affairs often are. If anything, he seemed more stressed, more anxious, like whatever he was doing was causing him distress rather than excitement. So, I watched, and I waited. And I tried to figure out how to address my concerns without sounding accusatory or paranoid. Tried to find the right moment to ask Daniel directly if something was going on, if there was someone else, if our marriage was in trouble in ways he wasn't telling me about. But I kept losing my nerve, kept convincing myself I was overreacting. That confronting Daniel based on these small observations would make me the problem, the untrusting wife. The paranoid spouse who destroyed a good marriage by seeing threats that didn't exist. So I said nothing. Just continued observing. Continued feeling the distance growing between us even as we maintained the appearance of a normal marriage to everyone around us. And then, 3 weeks ago, everything came crashing down in the most unexpected way possible. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was at home doing laundry when my phone rang. Daniel's mother, Patricia, calling from a number I didn't immediately recognize. Patricia and I had a cordial relationship, not particularly close but friendly enough. She lived about 2 hours away and we saw her maybe once a month for family dinners or holidays. She'd never called me in the middle of the day before. Never called me at all, actually. She usually called Daniel directly if she needed to reach us. When I answered, Patricia's voice sounded strange, tight, stressed in a way I'd never heard from her before. She asked if I knew where Daniel was. I told her he'd gone to Home Depot to get supplies for a project he was working on in the garage. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if I could come to her house. Right away, without Daniel. She needed to talk to me about something. The request was so unusual, so clearly urgent that I agreed immediately. Told her I'd be there in 2 hours. And I spent the entire drive wondering what could be so important that Patricia would call me directly and ask me to drive 2 hours without telling Daniel. When I arrived at Patricia's house, she answered the door looking pale and shaken. She ushered me inside quickly, like she didn't want neighbors to see us talking. And then she told me what had happened. Daniel had loaned her his car earlier that week. Her car was in the shop for repairs, and since Daniel was traveling for work anyway, he'd offered to let her use his vehicle while he was gone. She'd been grateful. Had been driving his car for 3 days without incident. That morning, she'd been cleaning out the back seat because she'd spilled coffee and wanted to make sure she returned the car in the same condition she'd received it. And while reaching under the passenger seat to retrieve trash, she'd found something. Something she immediately knew wasn't hers. Something that made her realize she'd discovered a secret Daniel had been keeping. Patricia could barely get the words out. Her hands were shaking as she told me. She'd found panties, women's underwear, under the passenger seat of Daniel's car. Panties that obviously weren't mine because Patricia knew my size, and these were much smaller. Panties that had no business being in her son's car unless he was doing something he shouldn't be doing. My stomach dropped. Actually, physically dropped like I was on a roller coaster. Because this wasn't vague suspicions anymore. This wasn't small behavioral changes I might be reading too much into. This was concrete evidence, physical proof that Daniel was keeping someone else's underwear in his car, that he was involved with someone, that all my observations and concerns had been pointing to exactly what I'd been afraid to confirm. Patricia showed me the panties. They were in a plastic bag, like evidence at a crime scene. Small, lacy, black with pink trim. Definitely not mine. I'd never owned anything that looked like that. Patricia asked if I'd known Daniel was having an affair, if I'd suspected, if there was anything I wanted to tell her about problems in our marriage. And I told her the truth, that I'd noticed Daniel acting strange for months, that I'd been concerned but hadn't been able to prove anything. That finding women's underwear in his car was confirmation of something I'd been afraid was happening but didn't want to believe. Patricia was crying now, apologizing for having to tell me, saying she'd debated whether to say anything at all but ultimately decided I deserved to know, that she was horrified her son could do this to me, that she'd raised him better than this. We sat in her living room for over an hour, trying to make sense of what this meant, trying to figure out how to confront Daniel, trying to understand how long the affair had been going on and who the woman might be. Patricia wanted to call Daniel immediately, to confront him right then and demand an explanation, but I asked her to wait, to let me handle it, to give me time to process this information and figure out how I wanted to approach the situation. Because as devastating as this discovery was, I knew that how I handled the confrontation would determine what happened next, whether our marriage could possibly survive, whether I'd be able to get the truth from Daniel or if he'd just spin more lies. I drove home in a daze. The panties were in my purse in that plastic bag, physical evidence of Daniel's betrayal, proof that my husband had been lying to me for months, that the evening drives and the locked glove compartment and all the small changes I'd noticed were connected to him having an affair with someone whose underwear ended up under the passenger seat of his car. Daniel was home when I arrived, in the garage working on whatever project he'd gotten supplies for. He looked up and smiled when I walked in, completely oblivious to the fact that I knew, that his mother had found evidence of his affair and called me, that I was about to blow up our entire marriage with a conversation we'd been avoiding for months. I told Daniel we needed to talk. The tone of my voice must have conveyed how serious I was, because his smile disappeared immediately. He put down his tools and followed me into the house. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten breakfast that morning, where we'd shared thousands of meals over 9 years of marriage, where I was about to confront him with evidence that he'd been betraying me. I pulled the plastic bag out of my purse and set it on the table between us. Daniel looked at it, looked at the black lacy panties with pink trim visible through the plastic, and I watched his face transform, watched him go pale, watched his eyes widen, watched him realize that I knew, that his secret was exposed, that whatever story he'd been telling himself about how long he could keep this hidden was over. Daniel tried to speak, but nothing came out at first. He opened his mouth and closed it several times, clearly trying to figure out what to say, how to explain, what story might possibly make this okay. I didn't give him time to construct a lie. I told him his mother had found the panties in his car, that she'd called me because she was horrified and thought I deserved to know my husband was having an affair, that I'd spent months noticing strange behavior, and now I knew why, that I wanted the truth, all of it, no more lies, no more excuses, just the complete, honest explanation of what he'd been doing and with whom. Daniel's face crumpled. He put his head in his hands, and when he looked up, there were tears running down his face. He said it wasn't what I thought, that he wasn't having an affair, that he'd never been unfaithful to me, that the panties were his. At first, I didn't understand what he was saying. The panties were his? That didn't make sense. How could women's underwear in a woman's size be his? Daniel must have seen the confusion on my face because he started explaining, started telling me a truth that was somehow more shocking than the affair I'd been prepared to confront. The panties weren't evidence of infidelity. They were evidence of something Daniel had been hiding from me for our entire marriage, something he'd been struggling with since he was a teenager, something he was deeply ashamed of, and had never told anyone. Daniel was a cross-dresser. He liked wearing women's clothing, had liked it since he was 15 years old, had been doing it secretly for 20 years, hiding this part of himself from everyone in his life, including me. The evening drives? He was going to secluded areas where he could change clothes in his car, where he could spend a few hours dressed in women's clothing without anyone who knew him seeing. The locked glove compartment? It contained makeup and accessories, items he'd use during these drives, the changes in our intimate life. He'd been struggling with guilt and shame about keeping this secret from me, struggling with the fear that if I ever found out, I'd leave him. I sat there staring at my husband while he cried and confessed and explained something I'd never imagined in any of my attempts to understand his strange behavior. Daniel wasn't cheating. He was cross-dressing, wearing women's underwear and clothing, living a secret life where he could express a part of himself he'd been taught was shameful and wrong. And he'd been doing it our entire marriage without telling me. The revelation was so far from what I'd expected that I couldn't process it. Couldn't figure out how to respond. My brain kept trying to reframe everything I'd discovered through this new lens. The panties weren't from an affair. They were Daniel's, bought for himself, worn by him during his evening drives. The small size wasn't because he was with a petite woman. It was because Daniel was slim and could fit into women's clothing. All the signs I'd interpreted as infidelity were actually signs of him hiding a fundamental part of his identity. I asked questions. Lots of questions. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't he told me? Did this mean he wanted to transition? Was he gay? Was he planning to leave me? Daniel answered everything, patient despite his obvious distress. He'd been cross-dressing since he was 15, when he'd first tried on his mother's clothes out of curiosity, and discovered it made him feel a way he couldn't explain, but also couldn't deny. He'd hidden it from everyone because he'd grown up in a conservative environment where anything gender non-conforming was considered wrong and sinful and something to be ashamed of. He'd gotten married hoping that having a wife would make the desire to cross-dress go away, that he could suppress this part of himself if he just committed fully to being a conventional husband. But it hadn't gone away. The need to express this part of himself had only grown stronger, especially over the past year. He'd started buying clothing online, started finding isolated places where he could dress without being seen, started living this double life where he was Daniel the husband when he was home, and someone else during those evening drives. He wasn't gay, was still attracted to me and only me. This wasn't about sexuality. It was about gender expression, about feeling more complete when he could present as feminine, even if only for a few hours at a time. He didn't want to transition, didn't want to live full-time as a woman, just wanted to be able to express this part of himself sometimes without it being a terrible secret he had to hide. And he'd wanted to tell me. God, he'd wanted to tell me so many times, but he'd been terrified. Terrified I'd leave him. Terrified I'd think he was sick or perverted. Terrified that being honest about this would destroy our marriage. So he'd kept it secret, had planned to keep it secret forever. Had never imagined his mother would borrow his car and find the evidence he'd been so careful to hide everywhere else. I asked to see the locked glove compartment. Daniel got his keys with shaking hands and took me to the car. Opened the glove box. Inside was makeup, lipstick, mascara, foundation, a wig, jewelry, shoes, everything he needed to transform himself during those evening drives. Everything that confirmed his story wasn't a lie constructed on the spot, but the truth he'd been hiding for years. We went back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and I tried to process what I'd learned, that my husband wasn't having an affair, that he was a cross-dresser, that everything I'd been suspicious about had a completely different explanation than what I'd imagined, that I'd spent months preparing myself for the wrong betrayal. The truth was shocking, but it was also somehow less devastating than an affair would have been, because Daniel hadn't been with someone else, hadn't been loving someone else, hadn't been building an intimate connection with another person while lying to me. He'd been struggling with his own identity, fighting against a part of himself he'd been taught to hide, living with shame about something that, when I really thought about it, wasn't actually hurting anyone. I told Daniel I needed time to process this information, time to understand what it meant for our marriage, time to figure out how I felt about being married to someone who cross-dressed when I hadn't known that about him when we got married. Daniel understood, said he'd answer any questions I had, said he'd give me whatever space I needed, said he was sorry for lying, sorry for keeping this secret, Sorry that his mother had been the one to expose the truth instead of him having the courage to tell me himself. That was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of the strangest adjustment period I could have imagined. 3 weeks of learning about cross-dressing, about gender expression, about the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation. 3 weeks of watching Daniel slowly open up about this part of himself he'd hidden for so long. 3 weeks of seeing him dressed as the feminine version of himself, which was startling at first but has become gradually less shocking. 3 weeks of couples therapy, where we're working through the breach of trust that came from Daniel hiding something so fundamental for 9 years. I'm not going to lie and say this has been easy. It hasn't. Finding out your husband has been keeping a secret this significant for your entire marriage is devastating regardless of what the secret is. The lying hurts. The breach of trust hurts. The knowledge that Daniel thought he couldn't tell me, couldn't trust me with this part of himself, that hurts most of all. But I also understand why he hid it. Understand the shame and fear that comes from being different in a way society doesn't accept or understand. Understand that keeping this secret wasn't about not trusting me specifically, but about protecting himself from judgment he'd experienced his whole life. And the truth is, I'd rather be married to a crossdresser who's faithful to me than to someone having an affair. I'd rather navigate this complicated situation than face the betrayal of infidelity. At least with this, we're working through something together. Learning and adjusting and figuring out how to integrate this part of Daniel into our marriage in a way that doesn't require lying or hiding. Daniel has started seeing a therapist who specializes in gender issues. He's joined online support groups for crossdressers and their partners. He's doing the work to understand himself better and to figure out how to live authentically without destroying his marriage or his relationship with his family. As for his mother, Patricia is struggling. She doesn't understand cross-dressing, doesn't know how to reconcile the son she thought she knew with this revelation. She's disappointed and confused and worried about what people will think. But she's also trying, going to her own therapy, reading books, attempting to educate herself even though it makes her uncomfortable. Because at the end of the day, Daniel is still her son, and I'm learning that love means accepting people as they actually are, not as we wish they were. Our marriage isn't the same as it was before. Can't be the same. We're rebuilding it on a foundation of honesty instead of secrets, of acceptance instead of shame, of trust that's been broken but might, with work, be repairable. I don't know if we'll make it. Some days I'm hopeful. Some days I'm angry about the years of lying. Some days I'm overwhelmed by how much our life has changed in just 3 weeks. But what I do know is that the panties Patricia found in Daniel's car weren't evidence of the betrayal I'd expected. They were evidence of a secret identity, a hidden part of my husband that was struggling to exist in a world that told him he should be ashamed. And while I wish he'd trusted me with the truth from the beginning, while I wish I'd been given the choice to accept all of him before committing to marriage, I'm trying to make the choice now, trying to decide if I can love and accept my husband fully, including the parts of him that don't fit into conventional boxes, trying to figure out who Rebecca is when she's married to someone more complicated than she ever imagined. My husband was secretly keeping someone else's panties, except they weren't someone else's, they were his. And that truth, while shocking and humiliating and more complicated than anything I was prepared to face, is somehow the truth I'm choosing to work with. One day at a time, one difficult conversation at a time, one step toward acceptance at a time. Because that's what marriage is. Not the easy parts, but the hard parts, the unexpected parts, the parts where you discover your partner isn't who you thought they were, and you have to decide if you can love who they actually are. I'm still deciding, but I'm trying, and for now, that's enough. The end.